Welcome everyone, Questini here with a discussion about some of the worst races in Total War Warhammer 3 in patch 5.2, specifically on legendary difficulty, though to some extent this will also apply on very hard difficulty, because the AI has been changed and buffed to a fairly extreme level when we are talking about legendary difficulty, and again, lesser extent, very hard. It will grow its elements on all difficulties better. It will recruit better armies on all difficulties, and on Legendary it gets a significant global recruitment benefit to the point that they're basically global recruiting for free, as well as doing it instantly. That is a gigantic benefit. What that means is you're finding more armies and better armies with higher ranking lords, with more heroes, more units that will defeat you. So there's a lot of strategies that we've used until 5.2 that relied on the fact that the AI wasn't necessarily recruiting very high tier units. So you could get away with a lot of things that no longer quite work. Now, don't get me wrong, the mainstay of a campaign is still going to be the early game. So if Creative Assembly was looking to try and make longer campaigns more interesting, not quite the success that they might have imagined. Most races in the game will benefit from this. Some more than others. Actually, you could argue that virtually all the races in the game will benefit from this, but some have such inherent weaknesses, or if they don't have weaknesses, they are held back in some way by the racial mechanics that while they do benefit from high more battles, because more experienced troops, more experienced heroes, more experienced lords, they are also suffering a lot. Because when you're dealing with tier 3, tier 4 armies on a regular basis, it is a very different thing than dealing with a bunch of tier 1 armies. And it's a different thing dealing with 3 armies from an opposing faction as opposed to dealing with 7. And that is something I've seen quite a lot ever since 5.2 came out. Vampire counts are a particular culprit in that respect. So with that in mind, let's talk about this list. Now, number 1 on the list would be ogres, but I'm just going to give them an honorable mention on this list. The reason I'm giving them an honorable mention is because, or dishonorable mention if you want to say it like that, is because they are going to be reworked with the next DLC. When will that DLC come out? We don't know. It might be late October, November, even December. We really don't have a perfectly good idea. The issue is, ogres don't have great post-battle loot, they have limitations on recruitment because of the camps, their economy is not great, they don't really benefit from taking high-tier settlements, so they end up falling behind. But again, they're going to be reworked, so they're going to end up, hopefully, being a lot better for it. And number 5, it would be Slaanesh. Now, Slaanesh has had issues ever since Warhammer 3 came out, but the change in the meta certainly makes things worse in terms of how they actually play out. The reason behind this is that you look at Slaaneshi's faction. They do have good campaign mechanics for the cults, for vassalization, but Slaanesh does have 2 very glaring issues. 1, replenishment, which is very low for Slaanesh, and 2, the army. A lot of the Slaanesh units take a lot of damage in battle. They do a lot of damage in battle as well, but the default roster, you look at things like Demonettes or Exalted Demonettes or basically all the demonic units of Slaanesh, and it ends up with a roster of units that take a lot of damage and you don't have good replenishment. This is a problem when you're dealing with a lot of potential enemies, especially when those enemies might be high elves, which you start at war with. That is an issue. You might be able to win the battles, but can you win against 4 armies in a single turn? Your economy, while good, or rather scalable, isn't necessarily up to snuff. On top of that, we do have an issue to talk about in the sense of recruitment slots, because Slaanesh does have fairly limited recruitment slots by default. Yes, you can increase it with the Drifting Forge, but again, just some initial limitations. And considering what you start as an initial situation in Ulf 1, this is a particularly big problem. That is the vicious cycle that gets created for Slaanesh. The reason Slaanesh is not higher on this list is there are some tools available to them, although I do think there's problems in the long term as well. But obviously the key issues are going to be in the short term for them. But here's the thing. Even in the long term, while you can use things like Chaos Warriors of Slaanesh and Health Scourges and Chaos Knights of Slaanesh, which are Warriors of Chaos or Champions of Chaos DLC units, the roster is not flexible. You don't have range units, you don't have artillery, you don't have incredibly powerful units that can deal with a wide variety of situations. And with AI recruiting better units in a longer campaign, you're actually going to fall behind compared to other factions. Because a unit roster, the units that you do have that might be flexible enough, well, because of the poor replenishment that you're working with, you're going to run into issues. You do kind of make it work with vassals, and you can let them play the game for you, but so can Warriors of Chaos. And Warriors of Chaos have a lot more versatility in terms of their armies, a lot more powerful faction mechanics. While obviously the Cults of Slaanesh and Seductive Influence are very powerful in their own right, it's kind of worth pointing out that is also available to the Warriors of Chaos. The cults are the unique aspect as well as the disposable armies, but those disposable armies don't replenish. And also, they're made up of units that, again, will take a lot of damage. You can think of, like, Khorne potentially having some of these same issues, but that's not quite true, because Skarbrand moves so fast around the campaign map that even though he does certainly have issues, never mind the fact that Khorne is going to be reworked as a race, but even though Skarbrand certainly has issues, you can make it work, and you certainly benefit immensely from fighting a lot more armies. I mean, let alone the fact that Skarbrand solos virtually everything that stands in his path. Seriously, the guy solos entire stacks through the bullshit collision he has. You don't have quite that same capability as an Akari. You actually have to stay and fight, which is a shame of a situation. And besides, Skarbrand has incredibly high replenishment available. You don't. Maybe you should. We can talk about recruitment, we can talk about various things, even the economy. There's a lot of things that Slaanesh does need. Honestly, there's things that the High Elves also need, because whereas it's very, very difficult to make the argument that the High Elves are a bad race, they're not. But the strength of the High Elves was built around the idea of them recruiting spearmen and archers and being able to win campaigns with that. Well, that's no longer quite as viable as it was before, because the AI is just going to recruit better units, and you may end up losing quite a few fights, or certainly far more difficult ones. So the dynamic is very different. The High Elves can still make it work, but it was already bad enough for N'Kari. It's far worse right now. You're pigeonholed into using certain units that no longer have the power, because the Warriors of Chaos could steamroll everything because the AI was bad at recruitment. Well, the AI is no longer bad at recruitment, and so any kind of issues with the unit roster really are felt far more so than they were before. I'll just give you an idea of how bad this is. I played an entire campaign as the Dwarves Belegar. I showed it. And I gotta tell you that the Dwarves were an incredibly powerful race. I had to fight for the victories I won in that campaign. And the Dwarves, incredibly versatile, incredibly powerful roster. With a race like N'Kari, which doesn't have a very powerful roster, and the units that are powerful are limited, it's a lot worse. And number 4, it would be the Lizardmen. Now, the Lizardmen have a different set of issues than N'Kari. The Lizardmen can get good casualty replenishment, though increasing the capacity for that for heroes is a bit tricky, because you do need to get to tier 3. Well, what's the problem? Many races, vast majority in fact, of the good races have hero capacity increasing at tier 3. Yes, this is generally not an issue. In fact, it's the norm. The problem is the Lizardmen have really horrible time increasing their settlements to a higher level, because their settlements take longer to build than anyone else. Like 5 turns for a tier 2 settlement, 6 turns for a tier 3 one. That's 11 turns just for building the capital. And then you gotta add in the turns it takes. Like once you get to tier 3, the 4 turns it's going to take. So you're looking at something close to 20 turns, because you got to account for the growth as well, to get the settlement to the tier you needed in order to increase King Chief capacity, which is your way of increasing replenishment. Lizardmen at least do have heavily armored units for the most part, so their actual casualties in battle aren't that horrible. But again, they do lack some of the flexibilities. Their range units, skinks are great, but not so great in like long range engagements. They're great in like skirmishing, close range engagements, and besides, if you're not playing Oxyatl, they're going to be a bit limited. A lot of the heroes are difficult to acquire, difficult to recruit, difficult to increase capacity. I mean, as Krokar, you can get Scar veterans at tier 2 and increase capacity at tier 3, but that's not really the case for everyone else. The problems just keep adding up. You don't have the economy to really support a lot of these big units. And your post-battle loot as a Lizardman isn't really that great either. So while you obviously do benefit from fighting more battles, fighting more enemies, especially considering you have limited armies, you are going to struggle in defending the territory. Jungle warfare is just freaking horrible in general, and the Lizardmen are really poor at it, even pre-patch. Because they have limited troops, they have slow-growing settlements, and other enemies, in particular Skaven, can literally dance around them. This is what makes them worse. This is what makes them a really bad race to play. I mean, they were already a pretty bad race to play before the patch. Now the issues they have are just furthered by that patch, which means you might have to deal with a lot of armies at the same time. And the problem is when you're dealing with an enemy that has 4 armies and you have 1, it's not fighting 4 armies with a single one that's the issue. It's that they could potentially hit you in 4 different locations. Now, they generally won't do that, but they will attack you in 2 different locations, or even 3 different locations if they can. That is the fundamental problem with having limited armies. And it's not like Lizardman campaigns are so safe. I mean, yes, Oxyatl is safe, but he's kind of a bit of the exception. I mean, Nakai, sure, good luck to anyone trying to take his garrison settlements, but plenty of problems in, say, Mazdamundi's campaign, Krokar's campaign, Tic-Tac-Toe's campaign, just tons and tons and tons of issues with the campaign design, the legendary lore design, and the severe limitations of the race in itself. Recruitment, army sizes, economy, growth of settlements, speed of construction, horrible research tree, you add up. Honestly, it's a bit surprising that I'm not going to put the Lizardmen higher on this list, because believe me, there's a lot of arguments to be made in favor of them. However, the thing about Lizardmen is at least they can make it work, which is not necessarily something I'm going to have to say about the races above them on this list. At number 3, it is the Tomb Kings, who can potentially make it work in the very, very long term, but by that point you've already won the campaign and the challenge has become an irrelevancy. There is a difference between practically making it work, which the Lizardmen can, and so can Slaanesh, even if it's a very painful experience, and making it work, but by the time you do make it work, it being an irrelevancy. But what are the issues for the Tomb Kings? Well, virtually everything. They're a faction that's limited in terms of the armies that they have. They don't have horrible replenishment, and in fact, their armies are completely disposable. You can easily recruit new troops for free, which is important. Sure, you won't have the experience, but here's the thing. Money isn't really the limiting factor in a Tomb Kings campaign. Other things are. Growth, pretty decent. Construction time, not really that great. So construction time settlements, unless you're playing Cetra. Even that's not really the big issue. It is a problem for the Lizardmen because it becomes an issue in terms of getting heroes, but the way Tomb Kings gain heroes is a very different affair. No, the issue is that Tomb Kings may benefit from fighting more armies, but it's a paltry benefit in comparison to virtually everyone else, because one of the things you basically want from every battle are canopic jars, unless you just want to get a bit of campaign movement range. We can talk about the limitations on confederations. We can talk about the limitations of the Books and Nagash, but those are not really the issues. The issue is you are limited in the number of armies you have, flat. You're limited in the number of heroes you have. Other races can at least increase their hero capacity through structures. You can't. The only way to increase your hero capacity is either going for the mortuary cult, which is the more expensive option, or being able to increase it through some lord skills, or more typically getting research, which in turn either costs money. That's not really the big problem, but the problem is canopic freaking jars. This is the issue. You want more armies? Canopic jars. You want certain heroes, dependent on the research, which takes a long time to actually get these dynasties. Canopic jars. Canopic jars. All over the freaking place. The good thing is that once you do unlock the hero capacity, you do keep that hero capacity. That's a great part. But the downside is all of this takes time. Spending 14 turns with only one army and only then being able to recruit the second one is exceptionally painful. Like, let me tell you, in 14 turns in the campaigns I've played, I have fought as dwarves, as empire, as other races in the game in 5.2 against numerous enemies. Doing this with just one army is excruciating. The sole reason that I am not putting the Tomb Kings, the only singular reason I'm not putting the Tomb Kings at the very top of this list of the crap races to play in 5.2, with the obvious exception of Demon Prince, who is so up there that he's not even going to be mentioned beyond this point. The sole reason I'm not doing it is that at least once you overcome that, you can use steamroll the map, because once you get the armies, once you get the heroes, once you get the unit capacity, you just steamroll everything. And if you lose an army, what do you care? Just recruit one instantly. Your lords have immortality the moment you recruit them. You get special lords. You get a lot of power long term. The reason they are on the list, despite that fact, is the campaign no longer matters. But at least they can do it. It's just not when it actually matters in a campaign. That's why they hired the Lizardmen. Because at least the Lizardmen can make it work when it actually matters in a campaign. Tomb Kings can't. You can't speed up research. You can't just instantly get more hero capacity without that research. You are going to be spending 14 turns to get an extra army, and then 15 turns after that. So you're going to be spending 30 turns. 30 turns is the meat of any campaign. Like, after, even with the changes. Doesn't matter who you're talking about, doesn't matter which race you're talking about, which lord you're talking about, that is the essential part of the campaign. That's why Tomb Kings are on this list. They might deserve a higher spot. Genuinely, they should deserve the number one spot, but here's the thing. Their heroes work. Their spells work. Their lords, yeah, I mean, okay. Mechanically, gameplay-wise, they work, even if the faction effect for, say, Katep or Katep's entire faction is complete rubbish, but at least they work. And this obviously doesn't apply to Arkhan. Arkhan breaks these rules because he starts with an extra army and he gets extra units, so he's just steamrolling the campaign. But I'm talking about the Tomb Kings as a whole over here. But you do have good units available to you. You have a versatile roster. You have artillery, you have cavalry, you have monstrous units, you have different types of spellcasting. Things do eventually work, and work so well you're, as I said, steamrolling the map. Now it matters at that point. And number 2 is none other than Norsca. Unlike the Tomb Kings or Lizardmen or even Slaanesh using the power of vassals, Norsca doesn't have a good time at any point in their campaign. This is a race that gets their casualty replenishment at tier 4. So if you want more than one army, and only one army if you're playing Trog, just to be clear, initially, you gotta get to tier 4, which is a journey and a half in itself. Your economy is non-existent on land. Ports do generate money, but the problem is ports are vulnerable, and since the AI has a lot more armies, guess what they're going to do? Your post-battle loot is pretty great, that's nice, and that is actually going to be useful in terms of dealing with the horrible mechanics Norsca is tackling, in the sense that, oh, you want to improve the various allegiance with gods, you got to raise the settlements. But you may want to sack the settlements and even occupy them. You don't want to leave ruined settlements. Because you don't have the ability of just preventing them from being taken over. Like, the reason the Beastmen are not on this list is for all their issues, and they do have them in terms of scalability. Beastmen at least genuinely benefit from raising settlements, denying them to the enemy, and getting a lot of dread from fighting all the armies the AI has. It might be a painful early game, but it does work. Norsca doesn't work. Like, flat out, it doesn't work. They only have one lore type that doesn't even have a freaking melee skill line, which is the most bizarre thing I've actually seen in the game. Their hero choices, yeah, they're pretty decent, but limited. Again, just very limited, especially in terms of that casualty replenishment. You can get you can get the other hero capacity increased at tier 3, though good luck being able to afford all of that, because money is limited. Post-battle loot does help keep you going, but the biggest fundamental problem in Norsca, beyond the broken loop of, oh, I'm approaching an enemy settlement. The first thing I'll want to do one turn is sack it. Then I'll want to raise it, and then I'll want to occupy it. So I can trade it in diplomacy to get more money to keep me going. It's such a broken system of gameplay that it really needs a complete redesign. Like, I don't know how you'd make raiders work in a Total War game, because, yeah, raiding territory is worthless, more or less, in every game. Nowadays, there needs to be a better system with that. But the biggest problem with Norsca is the unit roster. It's just not that good for most of the campaign. Like, you look at Norscan Marauders, they're pretty crap. Like, Marauder Berserkers, they do a lot of damage in melee, but they are very low armored, so until you get in melee with the enemy, where you do get the Berserk ability and increase your physical resistance, reduce the damage, when dealing with races like Keyslave, races like the Empire, who will have tons and tons of ranged units, and much higher units, tier units than you, you're just going to be slaughtered from range. You don't really have an option. Your fast-moving units are not capable of dealing with enemy cavalry, because your cavalry is pretty mediocre. Yes, you have mammoths, great. Giant-type units don't do very well in Total War nowadays, because they're big targets for everything, more or less. Though they can, again, do a lot of damage if they actually get in melee. Chariots? Now, that's a fine joke, really. I mean, they can do pretty decently, but again, there's many ways to deal with them. But yeah, Marauder Ice Wolf Chariots, pretty decent unit, but limitations. Just a very limited unit roster, where a lot of the lower tier stuff is not that great. Like, nothing here. No unit you can recruit at tier 1 is actually good. No unit you can recruit at tier 2, with the exception of Berserkers, is actually good. And while it does get better with Marauder Champions, these are units that take 2 turns to recruit, which is really annoying. Trolls, monsters do provide you some flexibility, but you're a melee-focused race that doesn't have the advantages of a race like Horn, for instance, or Warriors of Chaos, or Nurgle. The reason Nurgle, for instance, works is there's a lot of support behind that melee army, at least nowadays, right? Plagues and battle effects and tons of heroes that they can actually get good heroes as well. And magic that backs them up. Yeah, Nurgle is actually quite good right now. Still some issues, still could be improved, but Nurgle does work quite well these days. Norsca does not. Like, Norsca desperately has needed a DLC for years. So this is one of the highest priorities for Creative Assembly. You can make the money work. You can end up vassalizing factions through diplomacy. You know, good luck when so many people hate you. You do have the Norscan Confederation mechanic, though be careful how you use that, because it can blow up in your face. So you can benefit from that in an early game, but this is a situation where you really, really suffer in every respect, like early game, mid game, late game in a campaign, because the allegiance mechanic is something you're going to have to deal with, that horrible loop, the limitations of the roster inherently, how many replenishment heroes you're going to have in your armies, lack of economy, or the economy being vulnerable to small enemy attacks, having horrible garrisons, indefensible settlements. I can go on. But Norsca has a ton of problems that the patch has certainly put the shine on. But they're not the worst race on this list. And of course, at number 1, it is the Vampire Coast. Imagine a race that has a really poor economy, that can't work in the same way that even Norsca does work. Because at least Norsca, it's understandable. You get port settlements, you get income. That's not how the Vampire Coast works, because yes, you can get ports to increase your income with all of the downsides that come with relying on ports for income. High cost to build them up, vulnerabilities, so on and so forth. The issue is, though, you don't get as much income benefits as Norsca does, because Norsca does at least get a lot of money from their ports once they get the allegiance. That's the reason you care about the allegiance so much in a Norsca campaign. But on top of that, you also get the Pirate Coves that you do want as the Vampire Coast, which is your principal way of increasing a lot of the hero capacity. So you have competing priorities. On one hand, you do want ports. Even for hero capacity, you have competing priorities, because you do want ports for vampire fleet captains. On the flip side, for Morgul hunters or even gunnery whites, you do want to get pirate coves, which you obviously can't have in your own settlements. Let alone the mentality of attacking an enemy settlement just to set up a pirate cove, or using a hero, which you could attach to an army, and having very limited heroes. Or using a hero to set it up, but letting other factions control it. And playing a faction that a lot of people hate. Like, consider the vampire counts. You can make diplomacy work very well as them. You can have a powerful economy. And your armies, while limited in terms of versatility, you can have a lot of them. And you can recruit high-tier units from fairly early on in the campaign to the point that you're outpacing anything the AI can do. In fact, one of the main limiting factors in a Vampire Counts campaign is not pushing too hard on having elite armies, because you're going to bankrupt yourself. Though you do have a pretty decent post-battle loot situation. You do have a good post-battle loot situation as the Vampire Coast, but you have a really crappy army. Your heroes and lords are powerful. Powerful magic, powerful melee capabilities, powerful army abilities for the legendary lord, and for others, which is in itself a very limiting factor if only 5 of your armies are actually good, and they require you to spend dread in order to unlock. You don't have confederations with other legendary lords in your faction, which is something that even Norsca does have, with all the benefits that come with that. And the final nail in the coffin, your unit roster is, for the most part, complete rubbish. There's a couple of decent units here, though I'm gonna be straight up with you. Necrofex Colossi are one of the most hyped up units that this game has. It's like, oh, look at how great they are. They're not, really. Like, as I said, giant units in general don't do as well as some other units. You look at this guy, huge upkeep, tier 5 unit, and the actual damage these things will do in battle, and their durability isn't great. It is certainly one of the best units the Vampire Coast has, but it's not really great. Rotting Leviathans and a couple of other units, like Rotting Prometheans or Mongols, yeah, they're good, but again, limited economy, limited recruitment, does create issues. And then you have the artillery, the so-called wonder of the Vampire Coast. Well, here's the thing about the artillery for the Vampire Coast. You realistically only have 2 artillery units, because deck gunners, they have some range, but they do have a lot of problems. While line of sight and shooting in general for gunpowder units has been improved with Throne's Decay, it's still not good enough. Like, a lot of the Vampire Coast units, they're very limited in terms of their range, which is not a particularly great situation we want to deal with gunpowder units. let me put it like this. Imagine zombie pirate gunnery mobs against you know, Jezzails, for instance, or Rattling Gunners. They would be torn to shreds, and hell, outranged even. That is a significant issue. Your melee roster is worthless. Your monster roster is the only good thing about it. But your artillery itself, like, compare this to Cathay, or with their flying Hellstorm rocket batteries, or compare it to the Empire with their freaking tanks, Hellstorms, cannons, and mortars. You do have the best mortars in the game, but your carronades, yeah, let's just say they've fallen behind. And as for deck gunners, they do suffer from the issue of being an infantry type artillery, which is, by the way, an inherent problem that Iron Drakes have. But gotta tell you, do you know why Iron Drakes work? Because for all the weaknesses that come with that, or Trollhammer Torpedo Iron Drakes work, and they do work, let alone, you know, the Flamethrower version, they're freaking durable. This is one of the inherent issues for the Vampire Coast. Their units are very low durability. Your replenishment can get the job done, but it's not great. And low leadership. So once your army starts breaking apart, it all starts breaking apart. You don't have expendable units. You don't have the benefits that, say, say for instance, the Castors or even Bretonnia have with different types of units, you know, not affecting the leadership of other units. If zombies, you know, were actually freaking expendable, which they should be, and they're not, that would be better. So, tons of problems that come with that. Your units will collapse very quickly. In fact, they're so bad that you literally, when you're besieging a settlement, you literally don't want to use any of your army except using the artillery. It is an awful playstyle. It's not a scalable playstyle. And other factions outpace you. And you don't really have the tools necessary to neutralize factions. Like, I make the point of Beastmen. Beastmen do have the ability of neutralizing factions on the campaign map, or neutralizing their territory. Not only do you not have that ability, but you actually want to leave other factions alive, and you're a widely hated race, or widely hated faction. That creates a lot of problems in terms of the playstyle. That's all. Questine signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications.